The room went quiet at 8:42 p.m., and I remember the time because I looked down at my watch right after my sister said it, the way you check a clock after something breaks so you can tell people later exactly when it happened. "She's been unemployed for 2 years," Renee said, loud enough for the tables near us to hear, holding her wine glass out like a prop. "Jobless. A total loser, honestly. I don't know how she affords anything." She said it to the man sitting across from her, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, who happened to be my son's boss, Walter Hendricks, CEO of Halden Freight Partners. The man who had, 4 months earlier, sat across a conference table from me and called me ma'am for the first 10 minutes of a meeting before he found out who I actually was. He didn't laugh. He didn't look embarrassed for me either, which people sometimes do when they don't know what else to do with secondhand cruelty. He just set his wine glass down on the white tablecloth, slow and deliberate, the base making a small, clean sound against the linen, and said, "I'm sorry. Whose boss did you say I was?" But here's what none of them knew that night, sitting at that long banquet table under the chandeliers of the Halden Freight holiday dinner. I wasn't unemployed. I hadn't been unemployed in 30 years. I was, in fact, the reason that dinner had an open bar. Welcome back to Home of Secrets. I'm Diane Mercer, 54, a logistics consultant from Columbus, Ohio, though that title undersells things a little, and you'll see why. Tonight's story is about the 11 years I spent quietly keeping my sister's life from collapsing, the night she humiliated me in front of the one man in the room who actually knew my worth, and what happened when I finally let the truth do the talking instead of me. If you've ever been the invisible one in your family, the one everyone assumes is doing fine because you never complain, stay with me till the end. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. I grew up the second daughter in a house where the first one got the light. Renee was born 3 years before me, and from the moment I have any memory of her, she was the one my parents pointed to when company came over. She was the pretty one, the charming one, the one who could cry on command and get exactly what she wanted from our father, who otherwise ran our household like a man allergic to sentiment. I was the reliable one. That word, reliable, sounds like a compliment until you've heard it applied to you for 40 years instead of any other word. I brought home a report card with 5 A's and 1 B in 9th grade, and my mother looked at the B in geometry for a full 10 seconds before she said anything. Renee brought home a school play program with her name printed in the cast list. She'd had 4 lines as a tree, and my parents framed it. It's still in a box somewhere in my father's old house, wrapped in tissue paper, more carefully preserved than either of my 2 college diplomas combined. I worked through high school at a shipping depot near our house, loading trucks on weekends for $4.25 an hour, because I wanted a car and nobody was going to hand me one. By the time I graduated, I'd saved $3,100, which back then felt like enough money to buy a country. Renee, meanwhile, got a used Honda for her 17th birthday, paid for in full, no strings, because, as my mother put it once, not unkindly, just honestly, in a way that has stayed lodged in me for 36 years. Renee needs a little more help finding her footing than you do. I went to community college on a partial scholarship and transferred into a 4-year logistics and supply chain program, graduating with $8,400 in loans I paid off in 4 years working 2 jobs. Renee dropped out of her program after 18 months and moved back home, and nobody in my family ever called that a failure. They called it finding herself. There's a picture from that era I still have, not framed, just tucked in an old shoebox. It's me at 22, in a navy blazer that didn't fit right, holding a certificate from my first logistics job. Employee Distinction Award, 6 months in. Nobody at that Thanksgiving even asked what it was for. My mother glanced at it, said, "That's nice, honey," and turned back to asking Renee about a boyfriend I never even learned the name of. I kept that certificate anyway. I've kept a lot of things nobody else thought were worth keeping. By the time I turned 26, I'd started keeping a notebook. A plain leather one, cheap, bought at a drugstore for $6.99, where I wrote down every job I did, every number that mattered, every plan I had that nobody else in my family would have believed in if I'd said it out loud. I still have that notebook. It's on the desk in my home office right now, cracked and taped at the spine, 28 years old. Everything that happened later, Everything I'm about to tell you started in that notebook, one line at a time, long before anyone else knew what I was building. The quiet years began the way most quiet years do, not with a decision, but with a phone call. Renee married a man named Todd Bishop when she was 29. Todd had a talent for enthusiasm and no talent whatsoever for finishing what he started. Over the next decade, he opened and closed 3 different businesses, a specialty coffee cart, a home renovation company, and a boat detailing service that lasted 4 months in a landlocked county. Each time, Renee called me, not our parents, who by then had made it very clear their retirement savings were their own business. The first call was in 2011. Renee needed $4,000 to cover a mortgage payment because Todd's coffee cart hadn't turned a profit. I sent it. I told myself it was a loan. By 2013, I'd stopped calling it a loan, mostly because Renee had stopped acknowledging it as one. That year, I covered $11,200 in missed payments and credit card minimums. Quietly, through a personal check each time, no paperwork, no interest, no follow-up call asking when she'd pay it back, because some part of me, the part that had spent a childhood being told to be the reasonable one, had already decided I would never actually see that money again. I built my own company that same decade. I want to be clear about that, because this story isn't about a woman who sat still while her life passed her by. In 2009, I started Mercer Logistics Solutions out of a spare bedroom, doing freight brokerage and supply chain consulting for small manufacturers who couldn't afford a full logistics department. By 2015, I had 11 employees and a client roster that included 2 regional grocery chains. I sold that company in 2019 for $4.3 million to a larger logistics group in a deal that took 8 months of negotiation and that I told almost no one about. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had learned a long time ago that in my family, good news about me was treated like a provocation. I kept consulting after the sale, kept a modest house, drove a 9-year-old Subaru because I liked it and saw no reason to replace something that worked. And I kept, quietly, funneling money to my sister, because by then it wasn't really about the money anymore. It was about a pattern I didn't know how to break, a role I'd been assigned before I was old enough to understand I could refuse it. By 2020, the running total in my notebook, the actual dollar figure, tracked in my own handwriting, year by year, sat at $172,000. Mortgage shortfalls, Todd's failed boat business, 2 semesters of community college tuition for my niece, Ashley, after Renee forgot to apply for financial aid on time. A new roof after a storm, paid in full, because Renee called crying that Todd's insurance had lapsed without either of them noticing. There were smaller humiliations woven through all of it, the kind that don't show up on any ledger but accumulate anyway. At my niece Ashley's christening in 2014, my mother introduced me to a room of relatives as Renee's sister. She does something with trucks, while Renee stood 2 feet away in a dress I'd quietly helped pay for. At a church potluck the following spring, a woman I'd known my whole life asked me in front of a dozen people if I'd found anything steady yet, because Renee had apparently been telling people I was between things for over a year, a phrase that made my actual thriving consulting business sound like an embarrassment to be managed rather than a career to be respected. I said something non-committal and refilled my coffee. I have gotten very good over the years at refilling my coffee instead of correcting a room. I never once heard the words "thank you" attached to a specific number. I heard, "You're so lucky you don't have real responsibilities," more than once, usually right after I'd quietly wired money to keep her lights on. I heard, at a 4th of July barbecue in 2017, Todd tell a group of his friends that he was between opportunities right now, taking some time to find the right fit. 8 months after I'd covered $6,400 in missed payments so that time to find the right fit wouldn't cost them their house. Nobody at that barbecue knew where that $6,400 had come from. I didn't tell them. I have never once, in 11 years, corrected the record in the moment. I only ever wrote it down later, in the notebook, in the dark blue ink I've used since I was 26, because somewhere along the way I decided that if I couldn't be believed out loud, I would at least be accurate on paper. And through all of it, I never told anyone in my family what I actually did for a living anymore, post-sale. I let them believe what they wanted to believe, which was, I would learn later, that I was some kind of underemployed consultant limping along on odd jobs. I didn't correct it. Honestly, some tired, buried part of me wanted to see how long they'd go believing the smallest possible version of me. If you've ever tested your family that way, just to see what they actually thought when they thought no one was performing for them, you already know how that story usually ends. The breaking scene happened on a Friday night in December at the Halden Freight Partners' annual holiday dinner at a downtown hotel ballroom with a chandelier that must have cost more than my first car. My son Marcus works at Halden Freight as a logistics coordinator, a job he got entirely on his own, 2 years out of college. No help from me beyond a recommendation letter I wrote using my maiden name so it wouldn't tip anyone off. He'd invited me as his guest, and Renee had somehow talked her way into a seat at our table, insisting she never gets invited to nice things anymore, since Todd's latest venture, a used equipment resale business, had quietly folded that autumn. I should say clearly, I did not know, when I walked in that night, that the Halden Freight Partners holding company had, 3 years earlier, acquired a 34% equity stake through Mercer Logistics Solutions' successor entity, the shell company that now managed my post-sale investments. I hadn't looked closely at the cap table. I trusted the fund manager I'd hired. I found out I was, on paper, the single largest outside shareholder of my own son's employer roughly 6 weeks before that dinner, when a quarterly disclosure statement landed in my inbox with Walter Hendricks's signature at the bottom. I hadn't told Marcus. I hadn't told anyone. I was still deciding what, if anything, to do with that information when Renee opened her mouth at 8:42 p.m. We were 4 courses into dinner. Renee had had 2 glasses of wine and was telling a story about Todd's next big idea, a story nobody at the table had asked for, when Walter Hendricks, seated across from us as a courtesy to senior staff and their families, mentioned kindly that Marcus had a bright future here. "That's more than his aunt has," Renee said, gesturing at me with her wine glass, laughing in that particular way she laughs when she wants a room to laugh with her. "She's been unemployed for 2 years, jobless, a total loser, honestly. I don't know how she affords anything." I set my fork down. I didn't say anything. That's the part people always assume is impossible, that you can hear something like that in a room full of your son's colleagues and just set your fork down instead of standing up and defending yourself. But I'd had 36 years of practice not defending myself in front of that particular audience. Some habits are load-bearing walls. You don't tear them out mid-meal. Marcus went pale beside me. He started to say something. "Aunt Renee, that's not..." But Walter Hendricks got there first. He set his wine glass down on the tablecloth, slow, deliberate, the bass making that small, clean sound, and said, "I'm sorry. Whose boss did you say I was?" Renee blinked. "Excuse me?" "You said something about a job." Walter took off his reading glasses and folded them, unhurried, like a man closing a ledger. "I'd like to understand which job you mean, because as far as I know, Diane Mercer holds a 34% equity stake in this company through Mercer Capital Holdings, which technically makes her one of my bosses, several of them actually, if you count board seats." The table went quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet when everyone realizes they've been operating on incomplete information. A silence with a slight tilt to it, like the floor had moved half an inch. Renee's mouth opened, and nothing came out of it. "But please," Walter said, not unkindly, picking his glass back up. "Go on. I want to hear the rest of the story." There was no rest of the story. Renee sat there, wine glass halfway to her mouth, face doing the math in real time. I didn't say a single word. I picked my fork back up, finished my dinner, and let the silence stretch as long as it wanted to. Nobody at that table, not Marcus, not Walter, not the 3 colleagues seated near us who had clearly heard every word, said anything else about it that night. I noted quietly, in the part of my brain that had been taking inventory of my family my whole life, that not one of them defended me either. They just watched it happen and let it happen, the way people do when the truth arrives and they're still deciding which version of events is more comfortable to believe. I drove home that night with Marcus, who apologized 4 separate times for something that wasn't his to apologize for. I told him not to worry about it. I told him I'd handle it. I didn't tell him how. I want to be clear that what came next wasn't rage. It never has been, in my whole life. Rage has never been available to me the way it seems to be for other people. The kind of anger that gets to erupt and then dissolve. What I have instead is arithmetic. And 2 days after that dinner, I sat down at my kitchen table with my notebook and started doing math. I canceled the automatic transfer that had, for 3 years, quietly covered $380 a month toward Renee and Todd's second mortgage. A transfer she didn't know I still had running, set up back when Todd's boat business collapsed and never turned off because turning it off had always felt harder than letting it continue. I called the community college and removed myself as the emergency tuition contact for my niece Ashley's remaining semester, a role I'd held for 2 years without either Renee or Ashley ever once asking how the bill kept getting paid. I changed the locks on the lake cottage, a small, unremarkable property I owned outright, that Renee had been using rent-free every summer for 6 years under the loose assumption that it was somehow a shared family asset when in fact the deed had only ever had my name on it. None of this was announced. I sent no angry text messages. I made no declarations. I simply, methodically, stopped subsidizing a life that had just called me a loser in front of 40 of my son's colleagues. In my notebook, under the date, I wrote one line: "Ledger closed pending further review." That was the whole entry. Within 11 days, the smear campaign started, though I didn't hear about most of it directly. Renee began telling people, her book club, my mother's old church friends, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 4 years, that I'd had some kind of breakdown and was cutting off the family out of nowhere. She implied I'd always been unstable. She told my mother's friend, Carol Weinstein, apparently, that she was worried about what I might do. Language calibrated, I noticed, to sound concerned rather than cruel. The kind of language people use when they want an audience to worry about the target instead of the source. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't post anything, didn't call anyone to give my side. Instead, I opened a new file on my laptop and started documenting every payment I'd made over the past 11 years, cross-referenced against bank statements I'd kept archived out of nothing more than habit, the same habit that had me keeping a $6.99 notebook since I was 26. I built a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and a plain description column. No commentary. Just numbers laid end to end, the way I'd laid out freight manifests for 30 years. By the time I finished, the spreadsheet had 94 line items and a running total of $172,340. It was while I was building that spreadsheet that I found the discovery, the thing that turned this from a story about walking away into a story about setting a record straight. I was cross-referencing an old home equity loan Todd had taken out in 2016, one Renee had mentioned once, and I'd apparently helped cover a payment on when I noticed the cosigner line. My name was on it. Diane R. Mercer. My social security number, my signature. A signature that was close, but not mine. I have signed my name several thousand times in my professional life. I know exactly what it looks like, and this wasn't it. It was a passable forgery, good enough to fool a loan processor who wasn't looking closely, not good enough to fool the person whose name it was stealing. I sat with that for 2 days before I did anything about it. Then I called a lawyer, an old client from my consulting years named Priya Anand, who'd handled contract disputes for Mercer Logistics, and who I trusted the way you trust someone who's never once needed you to explain yourself twice. She confirmed within a week, after pulling the loan file, my signature had been forged on a 2016 home equity application to secure a $38,000 loan, one I had never agreed to co-sign and never known existed until that spreadsheet led me there. There was a second discovery, smaller, but heavier in a different way. Going through old boxes at my father's house that same month, he'd passed 2 years earlier, and my mother the year before that, I found a letter from my mother, dated 2019, tucked inside a Bible she'd left me of all things, not Renee. In it, my mother admitted, in her looping handwriting, that she'd always known you were the one who could be counted on, and I let that be a burden instead of a gift, and I'm sorry. She also mentioned, almost in passing, a small trust our grandmother had set up years earlier, $60,000, meant to be split evenly between me and Renee, that Renee had apparently already drawn down entirely, years before, with our mother's quiet, complicit permission, and never told me existed at all. I called the trust's administrator, a small local bank branch that had somehow kept the same account manager for 2 decades, and asked for the full distribution history. It took him 4 days to pull the records, and when he finally did, they matched my mother's letter almost exactly. Renee had withdrawn $28,000 in 2011, the same year Todd's coffee cart failed, and another $32,000 in 3 smaller withdrawals between 2013 and 2015. Every single withdrawal had required my mother's signature as co-trustee, which meant my mother hadn't just allowed it, she had actively signed off on it, year after year, while telling me, more than once, that the trust wasn't really enough to matter. Better to just let it sit. She'd let it sit for one daughter and drained it for the other, and never once mentioned my name should have appeared on either side of it. I didn't call Renee about the trust. I didn't call anyone but Priya. Some discoveries, I've learned, don't need to be confronted out loud right away. Sometimes they just need to be filed correctly, so that when the moment comes to use them, you're not fumbling for the right page. I didn't cry reading that letter. I want to be honest about that, because I know it's the moment where the story is supposed to break me open. It didn't. It just clarified something I'd suspected my whole life and never had the paperwork to prove, that I hadn't imagined the imbalance. It had been real and documented and quietly managed around me for decades. Priya became more than my lawyer over the next month. She became the one person who looked at everything I'd found, the ledger, the forged signature, the trust letter, and didn't ask me to soften any of it or consider Renee's feelings first. "You have a paper trail most people would kill for," she told me over coffee one afternoon. "The question isn't whether you can do something with this. The question is what you actually want to happen." What I wanted, I told her, wasn't revenge in the way people usually mean it. I didn't want Renee in handcuffs, not really, though the forgery alone was enough to make that a real possibility if I pursued it. What I wanted was for the truth to exist in a room Renee couldn't talk her way out of. The countermove took 6 weeks to build. Priya filed a formal report with the bank regarding the forged co-signature. Not a criminal complaint yet, just a fraud dispute. Enough to get the loan officially investigated and my name legally cleared from the debt. That process alone forced Todd and Renee to refinance the loan entirely on their own credit, which, given Todd's history, meant a new interest rate nearly double the old one, adding roughly $410 a month to a mortgage payment I was no longer covering. I didn't do that to hurt them. I did it because I was done being financially attached to a debt I never agreed to. I also, separately and much more carefully, worked with Priya and my accountant to formally document my equity position in Mercer Capital Holdings and its stake in Halden Freight Partners, not to hide it anymore, but to finally stop hiding it. Walter Hendricks and I had 2 long conversations that month, the first genuinely awkward, the second much less so, in which he told me, with a kind of professional bluntness I appreciated, that the board had actually been hoping I'd take a more active advisory role for over a year, and had simply been too polite to push after I'd kept such a low profile. I said yes. Quietly on paper, I became a formal advisor to Halden Freight's board, a role with a modest annual retainer, but more importantly, a role with a title, on record, that made the word jobless a matter of public documentable fact rather than a matter of interpretation. Priya also helped me deal with the trust once I decided what I wanted to do about it. Rather than pursue Renee for the missing $28,000 that should have legally been mine, a process Priya estimated could take over a year and cost more in legal fees than it would likely recover, I asked her instead to draft a simple written accounting. A 1-page summary of the trust's original terms, its distribution history, and the amount owed to me, $28,000 plus a decade of missed interest. Roughly $41,000 total. I had no intention of suing my sister over a decade-old trust. I had every intention of having the number exist, in writing, notarized, filed somewhere permanent, so that it could never again be waved away as something I'd imagined. I sent that document to Renee by certified mail, with no note attached. I wanted her to open an envelope, alone, and read the number in black and white with no commentary from me to argue against. I never heard back about it directly. I only know, because Priya's office tracked the delivery, that it was signed for 4 days later by Todd. Renee, for her part, didn't go quietly. There was one phone call, 3 weeks into all this, where she alternated between guilt and fury in the space of about 90 seconds, accusing me of abandoning family. Then, when that didn't land, accusing me of always thinking I was better than everyone. I let her finish. I didn't raise my voice. I told her, once, calmly, I closed the ledger, Renee. I didn't close the door. But I'm done pretending I don't see what I see. She hung up on me. There was also an attempted ambush. My mother's old friend Carol organized a family lunch 2 weeks later that turned out to be Renee, Todd, my cousin, and an empty chair, clearly meant for me to sit in and be talked at by a room stacked against me. I found out about it only because Marcus, invited under false pretenses, called me from the parking lot outside the restaurant and told me what he was walking into. I told him he didn't have to go in on my behalf. He went in anyway, sat down, and, according to him, said almost nothing the entire lunch except, at one point, I don't think you all know what you're talking about. Then he left. He's 26. I didn't ask him to do that. I didn't need to. The public reckoning happened at the Halden Freight Partners' annual shareholder dinner the following spring, the same ballroom coincidentally, though I hadn't chosen it on purpose. Renee wasn't invited this time. She came anyway, as Todd's +1, since Todd had, in a detail I still find almost too fitting to be real, taken a part-time logistics coordinator job at a Halden Freight subcontractor 6 months earlier, unaware, until that exact night, of exactly whose company that subcontractor answered to. Walter Hendricks opened the evening with a round of formal remarks, thanking the board, thanking major shareholders, running through the usual list of names. When he got to mine, he didn't just say, Diane Mercer, advisor. He paused, looked out at the room, and added, unprompted, some of you may remember Diane from last year's holiday dinner. I want to formally correct the record. Diane Mercer is one of this company's largest shareholders, sits on our advisory board, and built and sold her own logistics firm for over $4 million before most of you ever met her. I think it's worth saying that clearly, once, in a room. I hadn't asked him to say any of that. I found out later he decided to on his own, after Marcus mentioned, in an offhand conversation, how the holiday dinner had gone. I stood up briefly because it seemed like the moment required it and said 3 sentences. I didn't plan them in advance, but I remember them exactly. Thank you, Walter. I've spent most of my life being underestimated by people who never once asked me a single question about my life. I'd rather be underestimated than be the one asking nothing and assuming everything. I sat back down. I didn't look at Renee while I said it, though I heard from her direction the specific scrape of a chair against the floor, the sound of someone standing up too fast and then thinking better of it, sitting halfway back down, caught between leaving and staying. Todd, beside her, had gone the color of the tablecloth. Later that night in the lobby, Renee cornered me near the coat check. She didn't apologize. What she said instead was, "You didn't have to humiliate me like that," which told me, more clearly than anything else could have, that she still hadn't understood the difference between being exposed and being humiliated. I told her, the last thing I said to her that night, I didn't do anything tonight except sit at a table. You did the rest of it, 11 years ago, one phone call at a time. The aftermath ledger sorted itself out over the following months, mostly without my involvement. Todd lost the subcontractor job within 6 weeks, not because of anything I did, but because his new employer, once it became clear who exactly he was related to by marriage, quietly decided the optics of the whole situation weren't worth the trouble, and let him go during what they called a restructuring. Renee and Todd defaulted on the refinanced mortgage 9 months later and lost the house to foreclosure. They moved into a rental across town. The forged signature fraud dispute, once formally investigated, resulted in the bank permanently removing my name from the loan and issuing Renee a formal warning letter that Priya assures me stops well short of criminal charges only because I asked her to let it. My mother's old friend Carol stopped calling me after the shareholder dinner story made its way around their social circle, though 2 of my mother's other friends called to apologize for the lunch ambush, which I appreciated more than I expected to. My own ledger, meanwhile, filled in differently. Marcus got promoted to senior logistics coordinator that same spring, entirely on merit, a fact Walter confirmed to me directly because he knew I'd want it to be true independent of anything I could have influenced. My advisory role at Halden Freight turned into a genuine second act. Not a retirement hobby, but real work. Work that used 30 years of everything I'd built. And the notebook, the same cracked, taped, 28-year-old leather notebook, got a new final page that spring. A total, tallied in my own handwriting, of every dollar I'd spent trying to keep a family together that had never once, in return, spent a single dollar trying to see me. It's been 14 months since that dinner. I still have the notebook on my desk. I added one more line to it last week. Nothing dramatic, just the date, and beside it, 3 words. Ledger stays closed. I don't talk to Renee anymore, not out of anger, but out of something closer to relief. Todd sends Marcus a birthday text most years, which Marcus answers politely and nothing more. My mother's letter sits in a drawer in my office, and I take it out sometimes, not to relitigate anything, just to remember that being seen, even 15 years too late, still counts for something. If you've ever spent your whole life being the reliable one, the one nobody worried about because you never gave them a reason to, I want you to hear this clearly. Being underestimated isn't the same as being small. Sometimes it's just other people running out of imagination before you run out of patience. Family isn't the people who share your last name. It's the people who, when the truth finally sets down its glass and speaks, don't flinch away from it. If this story sounded like your life, or someone's you know, share it with them. Drop a comment and let me know which line hit hardest. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We've got a lot more stories like this one coming.